Meine Damen und Herren, Ladies and Gentlemen, ich bin sehr froh, hier zu sein in meiner Vaterstadt mit meiner Frau. Aber ich hoffe, dass nach fast 80 Jahren in England ich Englisch sprechen darf. So habe ich meinen Vortrag auf Englisch geschrieben, was ich viel schwieriger gefunden hätte, wenn ich es auf Deutsch machen müsste. Aber ich möchte mich enorm I'll fall into English if I may. Arnulf, Quadt, I want to thank you enormously and your wife and the faculty for this invitation to my wife and myself. It's an enormous pleasure to come back here. It always is, and you've made it particularly nice on this occasion, and I'm very, very honored to be able to take part in this celebration of the Physical Society with Professor Sander from Berlin, whom I've known for a very long time. Delighted that you are here, and we are very pleased to be back in the surrounding of my childhood. I hope it's okay if I speak English. It's very, very much easier for me. So I'd like to express the enormous thanks of my wife, myself, to you and to the university here for the invitation. And we have some other very good friends here. And I'm particularly delighted, of course, as you can imagine, to meet children like me of the great generations of my father's colleagues and friends, Heisenbergs and Weizsäcker, and that is a particular pleasure now. Being here in Göttingen brings up many memories from as long ago as 1926, my first day at school at the Volksschule next to the Albani-Kirche with a Zuckerhut in my arms. Coming home, das sollte ich vielleicht auf Deutsch sagen, meine Mutter fragte mich, wie ist es heute gegangen? Und ich habe gesagt, nicht sehr gut, Sie wollen, dass ich morgen zurückkomme. Und we have a very bright little granddaughter called Tilly, who has also just started school. And after her first day at school, our daughter, her mother, asked, how was it? And Tilly said, well, it was all right, but I didn't learn anything. My first post-war visit to Göttingen was in 1956, wanting to see our old house in Wilhelm-Weber-Straße 42 over there, and I shyly rang the doorbell. And a very charming lady admitted me and saying, she said, welcome, but tell me, what have you done with the bath? Was haben Sie denn mit dem Bad gemacht? Es ist ganz zerkratzt. Well, we had lived more than 20 years before, and in between there had been the war and the occupation and terrible privations. And of course, she realized after a moment that what she had said was really rather funny, and we both laughed for a very long time. Our host, Professor Quadt, has asked me to talk first about Victor Weisskopf, who is being honored here now, and then briefly about my father, Max, and his family in and after Göttingen. You will be talking about Weisskopf's work in science. My own work, I'm a medical person, and my own work has been in pathophysiology, far away from physics. And so I will talk briefly only about personal aspects based on his autobiography, on Weisskopf's autobiography, and on some long ago memories. I'm afraid I can say rather little about Weisskopf's from personal memories. He was in Göttingen as a doctoral student of my father's from 1928 to 1931. At that time, I was a 7 to 9-year-old boy. I have childhood memories, of course, of him as a very friendly member of the lively group of bright young people around my father here at the time. He was, like the others, often at our house for work and for parties. The only contemporary picture of Weisskopf in Göttingen that I could find is of him with I see. First, I want to quickly show you of two pictures of Göttingen. This is a view of Göttingen at the time towards Stansfeld from the Heinberg, and you can see it's a great deal smaller, but it was extremely nice. And the next picture shows the Marktplatz I think about 1927 with the early buses. There were very few cars. I do remember that. But I thought you'd like to see the Marktplatz with the old-fashioned buses. The Gänseliedl is exactly the same, and what the students did is exactly the same. Now, the next picture, I think, is of our house in Wilhelm-Weber-Straße 42, where I said Weisskopf went in and out together with Heisenberg and many other people who were students of my father's. And because my memories of him are limited, I read his autobiography, which is called The Joy of Insight. But before I show you that, there he is, taken from the cover of his autobiography, which is, as I remember him. And this is a famous picture of Weisskopf on the left here, Misi Göppert, Maria Göppert, and my father on their way to the Institute on bicycles. It must have been the 1928 or thereabouts, a little later. And I have many personal memories of Misi Göppert, of course, and so on, who was another student. I have inquired from my father's biographer, Nancy Greenspan, and elsewhere, but that hasn't produced any other pictures of Weisskopf from that time. And so I've read the autobiography, which is called The Joy of Insight, with very great interest. And I think those of you who haven't seen it, there's the outer cover of the book. Weisskopf's family history epitomizes, like my own, the liberation of European Jewry during the 19th century. Victor's father, Emil, was the son of a kosher butcher in a small town in Czechoslovakia. He was brilliant at school, the father, and he earned his way through the university in Vienna by tutoring the children of wealthy families. Victor's mother, Martha, came from a prosperous middle-class family. They married in 1904 in Vienna, where Emil became a successful lawyer. That's the father. Victor was the second of 3 children, and he writes in his autobiography that they were reasonably well off. Well, yes, indeed. They had 3 servants. There were large families on both sides. A great-uncle, Karl Kohn, later Kolbert, was a socialist who first ignited Victor's social conscience by saying that in the presence of the powerful, you should always be on the side of the weaker. Karl Kolbert's wife, Toni, was a concert pianist who initiated Victor's lifelong passion for music. He writes in his autobiography, "In one of my earliest memories, I'm sitting under Aunt Toni's piano while she plays Beethoven. I had the feeling that the music was pouring over me. My contact with her and with her music changed my life and enriched it enormously. Science became my profession, but music remains my religion." Now, I'm enormously in sympathy with that because I can quote a similar passage from my own family history. In Göttingen, our house on the Plankstraße, which I think I have on the picture, there it is, with the plaque to my father. Our house in the Plankstraße contained 2 Steinway grand pianos back to back. And one of my first memories is lying under the pianos and listening to our father and Heisenberg playing together, not only the wonderful 2-piano music by Schubert, but also transcriptions of symphonies, oratorios, and operas, a celestial field for a musical child. In a chapter entitled Becoming a Theoretical Physicist in Göttingen, Weisskopf describes his interactions with Max Born. It is instructive in relation to Weisskopf's later life to quote from that chapter. Max Born was very friendly and encouraging to me. But when I came in contact with the new quantum mechanics, I felt it was an esoteric theory far removed from ordinary human experience. I was still young and idealistic, and my involvement with human affairs and social issues had become very important to me. Once again, I thought I should change my choice of career. I considered giving up abstract science in order to do something more directly important to human beings. I gave some thought to switching to medicine and becoming a physician. After a year, I approached Max Born and expressed my fear that a life in science would isolate me from the concerns of humanity. He answered me with these prophetic words: "Stay in physics. You will see how deeply the new physics is involved with human affairs." He could not have known how right he was in both a positive and a negative sense. Quantum mechanics revolutionized technology and led to modern electronics. This is all a quote from his book: transistors, semiconductors, and eventually computers. These new developments in nuclear physics would lead to the development of the atomic bomb. But neither of us could have known then that only 20 years later this would happen, and that it would forever change our lives and the world. Weisskopf writes appreciatively also about Max Born's colleagues and friends. The experimentalist James Frank, there he is, that's me on his shoulder. As you can see, he was a lovely man. I remember him extremely well. And the mathematician Richard Courant and David Hilbert. That's Frank, as you will remember, with my father at the back of the town hall here. Frank died about 1 year later after the picture was taken. My father died in 1970. And then the mathematicians Richard Courant and David Hilbert, whom I mentioned last instead of first only because I want to tell one of the many funny stories about him. Hilbert lived across the road from us in the Wilhelm-Weber-Straße, and I remember him very well. Once when his wife was away, my parents invited him over to dinner, and just then a ferocious rainstorm began, so my mother invited him to stay in our guest room. He gratefully accepted, and everyone went to bed. Half an hour later, the doorbell rang. Hilbert had gone home to fetch his pajamas. It's a true story, and I have several such. In his published correspondence with Albert Einstein, Max Born writes, that's the top of the Born-Einstein letters, which I think you will recognize well. He writes, Weisskopf was one of my best pupils. He subsequently had a highly distinguished career. After Göttingen, Weisskopf went to Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, where Max Delbrück introduced Weisskopf to his future wife, Ellen. And here they are together. Ellen was a great dancer and apparently a very lovely woman. I never met her. They had 2 children and a long and happy life together. Ellen died in 1989. After a spell with Wolfgang Pauli in Zurich and a very fraught visit to Russia, Soviet Russia, which is worth reading about because it's full of insight about what was happening, and fully aware of the Nazi threat, Victor and Ellen left Copenhagen for New York in September 1937, and I quote, with few possessions but much hope. Victor vividly recounts their becoming Americans based in Rochester in New York. Early in 1943, Victor was told to move to Los Alamos for work on the bomb. He wrote, I was never quite sure whether my participation in the awesome and awful enterprise was solely based on fear of the Nazis beating us to it, and I can think of no one who refused to participate in the project because of conviction that our great science would be demeaned by serving in the manufacture of the means of death and destruction. We were all acutely aware that the whole civilized world was under attack by a force of the greatest evil. There was no clear-cut answer during the days of the Los Alamos project, and there still isn't, he writes. On this, my father, Max, did not agree with Weisskopf. One of the first books on the atomic bomb was by Robert Young's Brighter Than a Thousand Suns. You may know that. A review of this book for the BBC said, of all the brilliant men mentioned in these pages, only one, Max Born, refused from the beginning to have anything to do with what he called this devilish invention. I myself served as a doctor in the British Army and went with the British occupation force to Japan in November 1945, 3 months after the bomb was dropped on the 6th of August. Our base was on the inland sea near Hiroshima, and I was one of the first foreigners to go there about 4 months after its destruction by the first atomic bomb, a scene that is ever present in my mind. So I've always profoundly admired my father's ethical stand on this. But I also sympathize with Victor's dilemma, which was shared by so many other good people. Victor later wrote, the first bomb might have been justifiable, but the second one was a crime. There had been only 3 days between them, not enough time for the Japanese government to sue for peace. As so often, Shakespeare has it right. The evil of Hitler and Hirohito was stopped by atomic weapons, but their evil lives after them. Weisskopf goes on to assess Heisenberg's situation in the war. And there they are together, I think in 1947 or 48, including his meeting with Bohr in 1941, which is the subject of Michael Frayn's play, Copenhagen, which we will all see on Wednesday evening here, which will be performed here. Weisskopf writes, an open exchange could have been useful, but it didn't take place. I saw Heisenberg after the war, and he was a completely changed man from the man I knew before the war, innocent, youthful, and enthusiastic. After the war, the imprint of these tragic years was on his face. In 1947, Heisenberg came to visit us in Edinburgh. My father was friendly but cautious. They had been very close friends all their lives, all the time they were together. Another visitor that year was Max Planck, for whom both my parents had profound sympathy because of the execution of his son Erwin by the Nazis after the failed attempt on Hitler's life in 1944. My father said that he would have signed anything to save my life. Dictators come and go, but the truth of science will inevitably emerge sooner or later. From Los Alamos, Weisskopf moved to MIT. He was, like my father, deeply involved in the efforts to educate the public and the politicians in the entirely new era in human and indeed all life on Earth brought about by the atomic bomb, and in particular to internationalize atomic energy. As he says, I think I have a picture of Heisenberg with my father in Edinburgh in 1947 when he came to visit, and they were really, once again, very happy together. Weisskopf participated in public information programs about this. It took about 40 years, he says, for people really to wake up to the threat of nuclear catastrophe. From 1960 to 1965, Weisskopf was Director General of CERN in Geneva and gave a detailed, riveting account of its development. He writes that for an international project in physics, it was quite logical to turn to particle physics rather than to nuclear and solid physics. And I quote, since nuclear physics was connected with weapons, it would not have been appropriate for an international organization. This puzzles me. Surely that is precisely what is needed to help avoid nuclear warfare. Indeed, this has always been the dominant reason for the existence of the Pugwash organization, for which Joe Rotblat quite rightly received the Nobel Peace Prize before he died, and of which Max Born was one of the founders. As you all know, it's been named for village in Nova Scotia for the man who first gave the money for it, and is the worldwide organization of scientists and politicians and military men devoted to alleviating and hopefully ending the threat of nuclear war. Weisskopf was evidently an effective and popular head of CERN. In 1965, he went back to the American Cambridge and remained deeply involved in scientific and political matters, notably in the effect to reduce the arms race. In 1976, Victor was elected a member of the Papal Academy of Science. One of his colleagues was Rita Levi-Montalcini, who is here. Rita Levi-Montalcini, who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the first growth factors. During a visit to Rome about 3 years ago, I was taken to visit Rita, then aged 100. She's still alive, and she's 102 now, 2 years ago. She was kind enough to give me the last copy of the book describing her work, which I treasure. For Weisskopf, as a Jewish liberal scientist, working with the Pontifical Academy might have been something of a tightrope act. His account is sympathetic, the more so when the Academy celebrated Einstein's 100th birthday in 1979. Apparently, Pope John Paul II took that occasion to state that the Church's judgment against Galileo was a mistake. Later on, in Weisskopf's initiative, the Pope spoke out strongly against the nuclear arms race. Victor's last chapter is entitled Mozart, Quantum Mechanics and a Better World. It is a moving tribute to the arts and the sciences, as the toast of the Royal Society has it. He surveys the range and depths of classical music that meant so much to him, and reviews the outlook for science and for humanity. He hopes, as we all must, that the scientific revolution continues to bring benefits and not disaster. So the book ends with the credo of an insightful, courageous, and joyful man who succeeds in transmitting these qualities admirably. So far, my tribute to Victor Weisskopf, who really was a very wonderful man. Now, you kindly gave me permission to speak for 10 minutes or so about my father and our own family, because back in Göttingen. So I just thought perhaps I would do that. And there I am in Plankstraße 21 with my two sisters. You can see at the age of 3, so that must have been about 1924. And here we are, many, many, many decades later, outside a little house, in our country house at that time, with my sister Irene on the right, who is the mother of a famous pop singer. I don't know if you would know about that, but it's a couple of generations ago, I suppose. My sister Quadt, I'm afraid they have both died, my wife and myself. And many years later, Max, my father, was in Göttingen for 3 periods, which is here. He was a student in that time, then he was a Privatdozent up to the war when he went to Berlin, and he was professor at the great time when Heisenberg and others were also there. The institute looks exactly the same as it now as it did then. And one of the things he did at that time was to publish, I think, what was the first book on relativity, published in 1921, which all the physicists here may know. The other thing that happened was in 1922, they had the Bohr Festspiele. Bohr came to Göttingen, and they had a wonderful time all together. And here are, my father is sitting down. That is Carlo Sehn, that's Niels Bohr, James Franck, and Klein. And apparently it was a marvelous time with Bohr spraying ideas. The next picture is of my father's list of my father listed his co-workers, which you will probably mostly be aware of. There's Heisenberg and Heitler, and of course Hund, who became a successor. Pauli was here for a while, not very well. He was happier when he went to Bohr, I know that. He has said so. He said so. Otto Stern, who was a great friend of my father's, had already been with him in Frankfurt before he came to Göttingen, Max Delbrück, who became a brilliant molecular biologist, Meyer Göppert, Miese Göppert, Hund, and Oppenheimer was there, and there are various funny stories I haven't got time to tell you about when Oppenheimer was with him, and Victor Weisskopf. Then collaborators, several people here, including Norbert Wiener, with whom he did a lot of work. And there's my father with Miese Göppert on holiday in the early 1930s before we left. Then there were scientific visitors during that time, and you can see the list here. Fermi was there, Dirac came, Klein, Leder-Jones, Neville Mott, who was master of the college I belonged to in Cambridge, and who got the Nobel Prize later too, Wigner, Tam, and Linus Pauling, who came for, I believe, a relatively short time. So that was the heyday, of course, at that time of this time. We had to leave in 1933, as you probably know. We had a little flat in the Dolomites where the family was collected, and here many people came to visit him, including Planck here, and Hermann Weil, and this is Schrödinger's wife, and there's one or two funny stories about that I can tell you later, but I can't tell now. They had time limit, my mother and my father, and I was a boy, and it was very exciting for a boy, but of course very trying for my parents. And he had offers from all over the place, and he accepted an offer from, he had been a student in Cambridge, and accepted an offer from Rutherford, who brought him, he and Fowler brought him to Cambridge. So there's a picture of Rutherford, whom he revered, and we all came to revere enormously. A most wonderful man, quite apart from his science. So we came to Cambridge in 1933. I was a boy of 11. And then he was in Cambridge till 1936, when after a visit to India, he became professor in Edinburgh as successor of Charles Darwin, the grandson of the biologist who had been professor of physics, who went to Cambridge. And I have had a great-granddaughter of my Charles Darwin worked with me. In fact, there's even a paper out by her and me and a couple of other people. That was very exciting, and one of our daughters knows her quite well. My father got a Nobel Prize in 1954, and there is quite a nice picture. Sorry, we went to Cambridge. That's Cambridge, which all of you probably know. This top front is Keyes College, where he belonged. This was his first conference in Edinburgh in 1949, with some rather interesting characters there. There's my father. That is Darwin, his predecessor. This is Pyle somewhere here, I think there. And this is Klaus Fuchs here, the atom spy, who worked with my father for some time before it all exploded in 1949, and he was tried. And the judge said to him, "I wish I could have you executed, but I'm not allowed to." And so he spent 14 years in jail and then went back to East Germany. Then my father had he got the Nobel Prize in 1954, and that is the Nobel Lecture Statistical Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. And here is on his 80th birthday. I show this because you will recognize the people. There's your father here, and there is my mother, and that is Hund at the back and Otto Hahn on the left, who my wife remembers as a very jokey man and a very delightful person. Then I thought very briefly this is simply a put together of the things that strike people in the science as what is influence was, of course, on quantum mechanics. And there's a very fine book of the new edition of the Born-Einstein letters. And then as the founder of solid-state physics, before he ever got into quantum mechanics, he was a great humanist. And there's a very fine biography of him now from our friend Nancy Greenspan. I tell you a little bit about his background, and then I will stop and take it to the rest of the family. My father was, that's the cover of the book. His father was a biologist, a medical biologist, Gustav, born after whom I'm named. He did some wonderful work. He only lived 50 years, unfortunately, died in 1901. But his greatest discovery was the function of the corpus luteum, which is the yellow cell mass which forms where the ovary is extruded from the ovum of a woman. And after the extrusion of the ovum, a little mass of yellow cells grows. And my grandfather had the idea that this must be some gland to produce something valuable. And he put 2 of his pupils onto this to try and work this out experimentally, and they did. If you destroy it, the egg never implants in the uterus, and you remain sterile. And this was the idea, and there is the first paper that came out in it about the corpus luteum, an enormously important idea which later led to progesterone, of course, almost half a century later. Just a picture of us together in Edinburgh. I was a medical student just before I finished, and in the army, I was sent to Hiroshima, which I think I've already mentioned to you. There it is. At the time I got there, about 3 months after the atomic bombing on the 6th of August. And the thing that determined my career to some extent was that at that time, many people, probably thousands, were still bleeding. There, all over the body. You couldn't stop their hemorrhages. The reason for that, it was known at the time, but nothing could be done about it, was that they had lost these strange little things in the blood called thrombocytes or platelets. These are the blood red cells. That's a white cell, the leukocyte, and that is a platelet. But if you make an electron micrograph like that, it's perfectly complicated like all other cells. And these things, if you don't have them, you bleed. Now, on the other hand, these things, so that in fact these things, when they clump together, stop you bleeding. Here's a vessel that is cut, and you can see that all these little cells here plug the hole. And that is the beginnings of a thing called a thrombus, which if it goes badly in a coronary artery here, that is section of a coronary artery of somebody who died of a coronary thrombosis. And you can see that is the wall of the artery, and this is the deposition of fat in atherosclerosis. And that plug, which was fatal, killed the person, and it consisted, for the first few minutes, entirely of platelets. I worked on this, but also for another reason, which I won't go into. But the first paper in Nature in 1962 was on this topic and became quite useful to a lot of people afterwards. And then this was the first publication ever, or paper ever, evidence ever, that you could stop this process. You could inhibit it. And we didn't have continuous recorders at the time. We had to plot the points, and you can see that the control point, the platelets aggregate like this, but when we added the inhibitor, which was actually a adenosine derivative of the aggregating material, you could inhibit the process. That became a huge story, culminating in aspirin in the early 1970s through my friend John Vane, who won a Nobel Prize and became the medication for coronary heart attacks, of course. And I myself worked on atherosclerosis, on the arterial disease, and there was a summary of that. I'm still working, which is rather nice, and the next thing shows you that 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, I got interested in, I had always been interested in cancer because Flore, my great teacher in Oxford, interested his young men in everything. And I had the idea once, why, it's a funny thing, we were talking about this earlier, why do cancers spread everywhere, but they don't spread to your muscles? Muscles are all muscles, and muscles in young men make up 40% of the body mass. So it's a funny thing. It spread to all other tissue, but not to muscle. There was an open question. I interested a lovely man in it, an American called David Sassoon, and we worked on it. And that was the first big publication on this. The mice are exactly like humans. It doesn't happen in muscles. And we are now deep into it with one of my friends over here, Tom Joven. We're going to try and carry this on in a collaboration here with Göttingen. That is that story. And then I just show you there are my parents in Bad Pyrmont, where they retired about the mid-60s, and they were very happy in retirement, quite near Göttingen, so very easy to come over here. And then my father died in Göttingen, my mother died in Hanover. My father died on the 5th of January, 1970. And if you go to the cemetery here, he was a freeman of Göttingen, so the city looks after his grave. And there's the gravestone. Faith and I visited it yesterday. And there are other members of my mother's family and so on next to it. And the equation which he thought was his most important contribution is on the gravestone. But one wanted to end on one interesting thing that has happened in the last 2 or 3 years. And I'm no physicist, and I don't understand the physics, but I was written to about it. You may all know this, that the Frankfurter Allgemeine had an article under this title, Der dritte Schlitz ist anders, and it says, Max Born hatte 1926 richtig gerechnet, nämlich, dass two slits, everybody knows about the interference. When you add another slit, it doesn't really essentially make any difference. I'm oversimplified. I'm a biologist, not a physicist. But it's very obviously enormously interesting. And the next picture gives the title page and summary of the original paper. And I wrote to Obashi Sinha, and which was very nice, and she wrote back. And apparently this has become quite an important thing on Bronsrud, promulgated in 1926. So I thought it would be quite fun to show this, that this now continues. But even more interesting to me is his social legacy, because in Germany there are several schools named after him, and one great college in Recklinghausen, Berufskolleg in Recklinghausen, of which one friend of mine is here, which I often visit. This is the former headmistress of the Max Born Schule in Germering in Munich, Barbara Lohs, who's an admirable woman who ran the school for more than 20 years. And this is my son, Sebastian, who is now a director of the National Theatre in London. And so I have close connections with the schools. And the next picture I thought you might like to see, because those of you who don't believe in genetics, here's a bit of evidence that genetics is quite important. that up there is a picture we have at home of my father as a drawing by an aunt of a, I suppose, 8-year-old boy. And this is my grandson, Luca. Here, oh, sorry. This is my grandson, Luca. And I think you will see there's a certain amount of likeness there, similarity. Now the next picture is at my 90th birthday party. Helmut sees from Düsseldorf, my wife, having a good time. And finally, I wanted to show you what I think is my father's non-science, the most important legacy outside science. And I have this in his handwriting on my table at home. And it says, ich glaube, dass Ideen wie absolute Richtigkeit, absolute Genauigkeit, endgültige Wahrheit und so weiter Hirngespenste sind, die in keiner Wissenschaft zugelassen werden sollten. Andererseits ist jede Wahrscheinlichkeitsbehauptung vom Standpunkt der zugrunde liegenden Theorie entweder richtig oder falsch. Diese Lockerung des Denkens scheint mir der größte Segen, den die heutige Wissenschaft uns gebracht hat. Ist doch der Glaube an eine einzige Wahrheit und deren Besitzer zu sein, die tiefste Wurzel allen Übels auf der Welt. And the last picture is simply that in English. I believe that ideas such as absolute certitude, absolute exactness, final truth, etc. are figments of the imagination, which shouldn't be admissible in any field of science. On the other hand, any assertion of probabilities are right or wrong from the standpoint of the theory on which it's based. This loosening of thinking seems to be the greatest blessing which modern science has given us. For the belief in the single truth and being the possessor of is the root cause of all greatest evil in the world. And I thought with this, to me, rather remarkable and valuable thought, I would close. Thank you very much.